Okay, hello everybody. My name is Hanna Lucas. I am an adjunct tutor at Durham University in the UK, and I'm also an adjunct lecturer at College of the Resurrection in Murfield. And today I have invited my friend and former colleague, Seth Hart. He and I shared a supervisor, Canon Simon Oliver, who is wonderful. Um, so I invited Seth to come in and share on a session that I'm teaching on environmental ethics and Christian faith. So I'm going to allow Seth to introduce himself and then launch into kind of a lecture on theological concepts and theological commitments and the ways those can kind of inform our understanding of environmentalism, creation, great stuff like that. So Seth, take it away.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Yeah, so as you said, I'm Seth Hart. I'm finishing out a PhD at Durham with Simon Oliver and also Carmody Gray, who does some work in environmental ethics. If you want to check out her stuff on YouTube, she's got some great stuff. Yeah, and let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'll share my screen. You can see the pretty PowerPoint. Does that look all right?
Yeah.
Great. So I decided today to entitle my lecture something super clever, Christianity and Environmentalism. But before we jump straight into that, I want to tell you a little bit about a guy named John Muir. Now, I am an American. You probably could guess that. But John Muir, if you don't know who he is known as the father of national parks in the US. And another title he's recently gotten is one of the patron saints of 20th century American environmental activity, one of the great figures in the environmentalist movement. But what's not talked so much about John Muir is the fact that he was a committed Christian and that his environmentalist ethics derived from not only his experience of creation, but from his Christian faith. And I wanted to just give a couple quotations from Dennis Williams, who wrote a book called God's Wild, which is a sort of spiritual biography of John Muir. And what Dennis Williams says is, quote, Muir saw the primary source for understanding God, saw another primary source for understanding God, the book of nature. In nature, especially wilderness, one could observe and study the landscape and its plants and animals in forms that Muir believed came straight from the hand of God, uncorrupted by civilization and domestication. If you allow me one more quotation, Muir believed that God maintained the natural order, as the Belgic Confession asserted, and did so very directly, because God is immanent in the natural world. And what you see there is what Dennis Williams is picking up is the fact that one of the greatest early environmentalists justified his environmental thoughts, his thoughts of preserving creation, straight out of things like the Belgic Confession, this idea of the book of nature, which I'll go into later. It was a theological grounding that gave him the very vocabulary that he needed to justify his actions to advocate for national parks, the preservation of species. But don't take my word for it. Let's look at what John Muir himself said. So I took just a couple quotations from his works. In God's wilderness lies the hope of the world, the great, fresh, unblighted, unredeemed wilderness. The galling harness of civilization drops off, and wounds heal ere we are aware. And just one more quotation. Everyone needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul alike. Now, what is he saying here? Well, what his point is that nature isn't just out there as a thing that stands opposed to our civilization and culture. It's a place of healing given to us by God for our own healing, for our own very humanity. And this is the theology that he's working with, that he drew from the Belgic Confession, from Scripture. Now, my goal here isn't just to spend, say, 40 minutes giving an apologetic for Muir and talking about what a great environmentalist he was. What I'm doing is merely trying to showcase, using one example, how deeply ingrained the idea of God's creation is, and its protection is with the history of environmentalism. Now, as an American, when I first encountered this was a pretty striking fact because it's pretty well known that in the States, Christianity and the church and environmentalism aren't very good bedfellows. They don't tend to get along. In recent decades, it's become increasingly obvious that the church has stood outside of the environmentalist movement and quite often even opposed to it. This is sometimes justified on eschatological grounds, the idea that why would we defend the world, try to preserve it when God's just going to burn it up anyway? It sounds quite harsh, but that was actually something I was told growing up in the church. Now, I understand there are eschatological concerns there, but I really don't think that gets to the grassroots of where this resistance comes from. I think despite Muir's early influence, most of the environmentalist movement was picked up by things like on the left wing of politics, which Christians have increasingly pushed themselves out of, or by the New Age movements that then become associated with the worship of nature. And that's, in a sense, because of that, Christians have evacuated the entire conversation and done so with eschatological justification. And I find that quite odd because so-called conservatives, quite often where Christians will find themselves in the States, are standing outside of conservation efforts. Now, ironies aside, in the wake of such opposition by the church, the environmentalist movement has not only seen the church forsake any sort of participation with it, but it's also forced the environmentalist movement to find justification, ethical justifications for its activity on non-Christian grounds. If the church isn't there to be a conversation partner, the environmentalist movement will work with whatever it has available. Now, what has it done to do that? Now, I want to outline three possible positions, the two being the most prominent within the environmentalist movement. The first one is anthropocentrism, the second is ecocentrism, and the third is Christocentrism. These are the three ways of ethically justifying why ought we preserve the environment. Let's start with this first one. So anthropocentrism. As the name implies, this is a view that subordinates the world to human needs. Why does nature have value? Well, all value is actually human value. It's us that gives value to things. Money only has value because we give it value. Or a baseball card only has the value that it has because we give it a certain amount of value. Well, the same goes for everything. Value is a human construction. Therefore, all value should be considered with respect to us. And creation is just merely an instrumental good for our own survival. So while this view has a very deep history, contemporary versions can be traced back to Francis Bacon, who actually used a biblical justification for this idea of anthropocentrism. So contemporary versions, though, they normally don't appeal to any sort of biblical justification, obviously. They mostly appeal to our own selfish desires for self-preservation. If we destroy the world, we're part of that. We get destroyed as well. And there's a good case to be made for what they're saying. As far back as the 5th century with Plato, he talks about how the deforestation of the Greek hills had caused devastation for them. Fast forward a few centuries, the Romans had deforested entire regions and created massive pollution in their major population centers, especially in Rome, but also in places like Alexandria and Antioch. And that likely, many historians think, that hastened their own decline. Similar stories have been hypothesized about the civilizations of Latin America, China, and Polynesia. This is a repeated refrain that we see going on throughout history. We destroy the environment, we get destroyed in the process. And history is now threatening to repeat itself again, only this time on a much worse global scale. So the anthropocentrists are saying, you don't need to appeal to anything outside of self-interest to justify taking drastic actions in order to preserve humanity. Now, we've done this before. The Green Revolution of the 1950s, as it's called, that with that new technology, new farming techniques, that's been able to sustain the exponential growth of the human population up until now, which I just found out just reached 8 billion people. But what did it cost us? Well, by numbers, it cost us 38% of the terrestrial surface area. That's how much of the area of the world is used just to feed humanity. 38%. It's a remarkably big number. And the question is, if the population keeps growing bigger, how much more will we need? If we keep destroying the environment, what other needs are we destroying? And so what the anthropocentrist is trying to do is appeal to our most basic instincts. But there's a problem there, and you probably have already caught it. And that comes from the famed book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Now, in that book, Rachel Carson talks about going by a spring that used to hear the songs of birds and no longer hearing those songs anymore. Is there any value to bird songs, to the beauty that we hear when we hear those songs? Well, from an anthropocentric viewpoint, probably not. We can sustain humanity quite well if it means absolute decimation of all environments not suited to our needs. You see 38% there. Why not up it to 50%? Why not up it to 60% if that means that it suits our needs better? What value do obscure bugs or a bird song by the river mean to the anthropocentrist? And the answer is none. And I've had this conversation actually quite recently with some anthropocentrists who just admit that they don't find any absolute value in these sort of non-human related goods. So because of that, anthropocentrism, while it does have its advocates, it's not the major viewpoint among environmentalists. The major one is one you're probably more familiar with, which was ecocentrism. Now, what is ecocentrism? Well, in short, because of the issues with anthropocentrism, many scientists and thinkers have pushed back to try and invest creation with its own value, not directly related to our own survival. And what this tries to do is overcome this nature-human dualism, and by subsuming humanity back into nature. Value isn't just a human-created thing based on our own value. Nature itself has its own values. And as far back as I can trace this is Alexander von Humboldt. So it's relatively new on the world scene, but nevertheless, it has at least somewhat of a history. And I think conservation biologists has been largely rooted today in this perspective, that the central value has been the intrinsic good of biodiversity in itself. You don't need to appeal to anything besides the survival of the obscure bug in order to justify its value. The bug just has value on its own. So the movement is committed to the value of the natural world. But there is a debate now within those who hold to ecocentrism, which is, why should such value exist? Why ought we prefer it to anthropocentrism? Is it just an inner feeling, or can we give some sort of rational basis for this? Well, two prominent answers have been given. These are broad-scale movements that I'm really just sort of brushing over the surface of. And the first one is utilitarianism, and the second one is the intrinsic value. Let's take each one in turn. Utilitarianism says humans benefit from nature, not only for survival. That's what the anthropocentrist says. Humans benefit from nature, but we should only measure that in terms of our own survival. Utilitarians say we also benefit from things that are not survival related, such as enjoyment and pleasure. The national park doesn't mean much to an anthropocentrist, but the national park means a lot to a utilitarian. There's certain values and goods that can't be measured by bare survival. And they actually have a name for this. They're called ecosystem services. Now, that sounds like an improvement Yet the movement still faces a critique. And that critique is that it still seems to reduce all value to economic values. How much good is a national park next to, say, the value of farmland? Well, what the utilitarian will say is we can still measure this value out in terms of economic value. The national park actually brings in quite a bit of money. And that's a system that gives us pleasure. It gives us a good that just food on its own doesn't. So therefore, it needs protection. Now, wait a second, though. What about values that are not measurable by the market? Yeah, the obscure bug that you might occasionally see and it gives you pleasure to see a new species, that's pretty great. But shouldn't creatures have value outside of the human market system? And again, it just seems like this view hasn't completely divorced itself from anthropocentrism. And that's been the main critique of the utilitarian position. Why are natural values still being measured by human monetary standards? So I think this is a step in the right direction, that it captures the fact that all values should not be reduced to pure human survival, but they still reduce value in some sense to being measured by human values. So that's why in the large portion of those who hold to the ecocentrist position go for the intrinsic value position. Now, this is most notably found in an essay by Aldo Leopold on land ethics in a Sand County Almanac. Now, what does Leopold say? Well, Leopold argues that social responsibility is an evolving thing. Originally, humanity, way back in the day, you had a social responsibility to your family and maybe to a small tribe that's centered around you, but you didn't really have a social responsibility to people on far-flung corners of the planet. They might as well have been aliens to you. But as human culture has evolved, then it became that not just to your small community, but then you got a tribe, and then you're loyal to the larger tribe. So I have Cherokee blood in me. I'm a descendant of the Cherokees, and so theoretically, my ancestor would say, well, I am a Cherokee, so therefore I have loyalty to the Cherokee tribe. That's a larger community than just the smaller tribe. But then that evolved even more, especially in Western Europe, into the nation. And then from the nation, now we're to a point where it's to the global humanity. So in a global humanitarian effort, we can now pour resources in that the person on the other side of the planet no longer is just an alien to me. That person is someone I am obligated to help. And for Leopold, what he says is originally it made sense to hold slaves. You had no obligation to have a slave or to not own a slave because you had no obligation to that person. But as ethics have evolved and we've come to understand our obligation to humanity globally, slavery did not make sense anymore. Now Leopold says it's time to make the next step beyond humanity. We've expanded our perception of our social responsibility from tribes to nations, now to the planet. It's time to include the non-human natural world into that scope as well. So that seems good. But there's also a problem with that, because it can't seem to differentiate when we can use nature. When is it okay to say, eat meat? When it is okay to cut down a tree? When it is okay to use natural resources for our own good? In the case of humans, we never want to treat them as mere means to an end. But it seems like we have to do that with the natural world quite often. And while Leopold's idea, it sounds great on the surface, it doesn't give us the ability to measure or weigh our needs against the rest of the world, and they're quite often in competition. In fact, the environmentalist history, by taking Leopold's idea to an extreme, there's been many instances where this colonialist attitude has been used to harm indigenous peoples. So it's recently, despite the how good it sounds on the surface, it's more recently been shown to have its own intrinsic problems. because conservation needs to care as much about people as it does about the creation that it's trying to preserve, the natural world that it's trying to preserve. And Leopold's framework doesn't give us a framework by which we can understand that or measure these against one another. And I think perhaps the biggest question, not only for the intrinsic value, but just for ecocentrism in total, is why should we care? This is a bit of a meta critique. Why should we care about the world? Again, I get back to the question of what is it about ecocentrism that makes it preferable to anthropocentrism? Species have always outcompeted other species for the sake of their own self-interest. The fossil record is replete with examples of this. Why ought we be any different? Why are humans of all species obligated to care for the tiny little bug when no other species in the history of the planet, as far as we know, has ever cared? And so I'm not sure, despite sounding better to our own moral sense than anthropocentrism, I'm not sure it can justify itself on its own. And that's when I want to introduce the last perspective, Christocentrism. Now, as the name implies, I think that Muir was on the right track when he grounded ethical concerns on a theological framework. Now, many environmentalists will be quite suspicious of this because of the very mixed history the church has had with the environment, with its protection of the environment. As I noted before, Baconian ideas, this idea of Francis Bacon of dominating the world, these were used to justify total subjugation of creation, and this was seen as a fulfillment of the Genesis mandate. But I think Muir shows us that we need an ethical framework that can subsume and yet at the same time subvert both the anthropocentric and the egocentric framework. Something that can bring together the goods of both. Humans have their value, that we need to see humans as valuable, but also nature has its value, and we need a system to be able to measure these against it. Some sort of grounding system, something more fundamental by which we can measure these against one another. And I think Christocentrism might give us that framework. But what is this idea? So let me just outline a little bit of how I think the Christian theological framework gives us the resources that we need to understand environmental ethics. First off is Christians are teleological realists. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that Christians affirm that life forms have their own intrinsic goods. Now, this is a long topic on its own, and this is actually the subject of my PhD dissertation, so I run the risk of talking forever about this, so I'll try and keep it short. What I mean is that when I look at a plant, I can see that the plant strives to fulfill a certain good, namely its own growth, its own maintenance, its own reproduction. These are goods that the plant has in itself. In the same way, I have my own goods, which is my own growth, my own reproduction, etc., 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 etc. Every creature on the planet has these different goods. And while the Darwinian picture gives us this idea that it's competing, the Christian framework also says, well, hold on, it's also in communion. We find ourselves fundamentally in relationship with one another. The plant needs water. I need the plant. The plant needs me. For instance, whenever we pass away, we give nutrients, we bring nutrients back into the earth. The great circle of life that Lion King taught us so famously. This picture is that we are in relationship with one another and dependent upon one another, even though in some sense humanity is above the creatures. We do have an ontological priority, that there is a chain of being. So that's the picture of the world that Christianity, especially in its medieval formulations, gave to us. And while that great chain of being has often been seen as the problem, I would argue that it was actually the destruction of the great chain of being, where every chain relies upon the other. that was the beginnings of the big environmentalist problems that we have. It was when we began to see ourselves as absolute monarchs over creation rather than as intimately connected with creation that things went astray. In fact, Hans Jonas, who's one of the great environmentalist thinkers of the 20th century, he wrote a book called The Imperative of Responsibility. He tried to return to this framework. And there's been quite a few thinkers who've gone in his footsteps and tried to return to this framework of seeing nature as having its own intrinsic goods. But Jonas's bigger point was that we are born into a world where care is fundamental. I have my own intrinsic needs. Creation has its own intrinsic needs. You have your own intrinsic needs. But we need to care for one another in the sense that my needs are met through your needs and your needs through our needs. So one of our fundamental ways that we experience this world is through this aspect of care. We need to care for one another in order so that we all can together flourish. I need to care for the plants so that I can flourish. The plants give me nutrients so that they themselves can flourish. That's a fundamental way we meet the world. But the problem is that care implies inequality and responsibility. Inequality in the sense that I might have something that you don't need, or that you need, and you might have something that I need. I have stuff that the world needs, that creation needs. The created world has stuff that I need. It's an unequal relationship, and it gives us the responsibility, everyone, this global responsibility of care for one another. And so this care for the world is to fundamentally understand our place within it. It's to understand what we need and what we can contribute. Now, Jonas was a Jewish philosopher. From a Christian framework, we can still ask, what is our place? If we're going to say care about the world, we need to know our place within it, that these two ideas are tied together. It's important to know what the human place in the world is. And here's just a few points on that. First off, teleology ends not just for organisms. It should say teleology ends not just for organisms, but for the whole planet. My ends tie in to Hanna's ends, which tie in to the environment ends, which tie into, it's this giant web. But ultimately, thinkers like Thomas Aquinas would often talk about the perfection of the world. When the whole system works together, we can nearly view the entire globe as one organism. It's not the Gaia hypothesis which takes it seriously, but it's just the idea that there is a perfection, there is a good for the world itself. And only when this care, this responsibility is taken seriously, can the whole system work? Can the good of the planet flourish? Christianity gives us this vocabulary then for measuring the goods of the world against human needs by tying us together into a single system. And I often love this image of microcosm. This is more of an Eastern Christian framework, but this idea of humans as microcosms. Microcosms, as you probably know from the word, small universe, that we are in ourselves a small universe. That though we are material, but we're also spiritual in nature. In that sense, we sort of stand between heaven and earth for creation. And that we can therefore serve as, in a sense, priests for creation between God and the world. And what that allows us to do is to see not just our place within the world, but our unique place within the world as standing above creation, but also within it. Our unique responsibility for ensuring the good of the world. And I think another medieval word, that book of nature that was so important to Muir. Well, as far back as I can trace it, that's a late medieval concept. And so when we see the good of the world, we're seeing the goods that God has instilled within it. The world, according to the medievals, spoke symbolically of God. This book of the world. Now, I know there's quite a few people who might be training for a priesthood. If you ever go inside an Anglican church, I always take people, especially Americans who aren't familiar with this, take them in and say, go find a pelican. It's kind of a shocking thing for Americans who've never realized that there are quite often pelicans within Anglican churches, which is wonderful. I think it's just one of the most wonderful things is that this, what seems to be a random animal, which isn't found in scripture, somehow makes its way into churches. And the reason, of course, is because they thought pelicans in times of great drought would pluck themselves in order to spray out bloods in order to feed their infants, to sacrifice themselves for the sake of their children. And of course, they read this Christologically. They didn't just think, oh, here's a cool parallel between the natural world and the story of Christ. They thought that this actually spoke like the symbols which become the words on a page. This is a natural symbol, a word that spoke of Christ. That's how they read the world. And so to not care for the good of the world for the medievals constituted the same sort of violation as it would be to scratch out the words of Scripture. Take that in for a second. To not care for the symbolic world that God gave to us would constitute the same offense as it would be to scratch out the words of Scripture. That's what it would be to see like the very extinction of plants and animals that we see going on today. It's to take this symbolic word that God has given to us and defile it. And this, again, this fits into this picture that there is a singular world good. So unlike anthropocentrism, which judges creation by our values, or ecocentrism, which sacrifices human values for creations, the Christocentric view sees the world as all sharing in one fundamental aim: redemption and reconciliation to God. Romans chapter 8, the whole world groans in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. The whole world groans for us to get our act together. To me, this is properly Christological. It means that we sacrifice ourselves. We care for those below us ontologically, those under our care, as Hans Jonas used it, and unconditional love simply by the fact that the world is the creation of God. We treat it with that sacredness of being something that flowed from the very words of God himself. That's what I think the Christian framework can give to the environmentalist movement, which right now is deeply seeking an ethical grounding for the very movement itself. And I think this view matters really even more so than just a sort of abstract philosophical grounding. There's two other things I think it ultimately gives us. First off, it provides us with meaning. David Hume, well, he didn't say a lot of right things, but he did say this thing that was right. He noted that if you're in pain, that doesn't evoke a response in me. That's a fact. If I see Hanna in pain, that's just a fact about the world. If I am to be motivated to do something, I need to find some meaning in that. I need to see that there's some meaning behind the fact that Hanna is in pain, that I need to do something. Facts don't force us into action. They don't call us to action. Meaning does. One of the biggest problems that I see in the environmentalist movement today is the idea that our problem is that we have shortage of facts. If we just had more facts, if people got the facts more, then we could solve this apathy that we have going. But data actually shows the exact opposite. The more people know about climate change, the more fatalistic and number they get to the data, the less action they actually want to do. They just say, this is inevitable. We can't do anything. We might as well accept our fate. That's where data is pointing right now. The problem is that we don't have enough facts. The problem is we don't have enough meaning. Meaning is what causes us to act. It gives us a reason, a goal. To go back to teleology, it gives us a telos. It allows us to see what to do, that meaning, that framework that I just described. And I think this teaches us that we're primarily creations of love. We're not primarily creations of truth. We're not robots or computers. We're creations of love. What we need is not more truth, we need more love. And that's why I think the world now doesn't need more scientists, doesn't need more environmentalists getting up on stage. It needs the church. The strongest predictors of environmental action is not belief, it's demographic. And the church is just such a demographic. Now, what that means is the priest, the pastor, the elder, whoever, they are in a place that any environmentalist scientist should be envious of. They are in a place to create a community centered around giving people meaning, motivating action in a way that getting up and just spouting off facts can never do. This is why I think it is so important for the church to re-enter the conversation, because it gives that missing ingredient that we see such a lack of in environmentalism today. That's number one. Number two is it provides hope. That's something that's quite often missing in the conversation today. We get a lot of emergency, but where is the hope in all of this? And I think Revelation 22 is where we need to center ourselves, because Revelation 22 ends where Genesis 1 and 2 began. It's in a garden, but there's something different about this garden. It's also a city. What we see in the end, and perhaps I'm reading too much into this, is a symbiotic relationship. Humanity and the rest of creation are flourishing together. A garden, a natural growth, and a city, a human growth, flourishing together, not in competition like we think of nature versus culture, the city versus the environment, but together in conjunction. And I think the antidote against hopelessness, against this fatalistic attitude, is a clear vision. And I think Revelation gives us that. I think the Christian framework gives us that. It gives us a sense of hope, and it gives us a meaningful actions by which we can do that. All of this to say is the church, as I've heard, sure you've heard a million times, is the hope of the world. And I think that's just as true for the environment as it is anything else. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Seth. That was great. You gave us so much to work with and to ponder together. So I wonder if you can you stop sharing screen?
Yeah, I'm curious how I do this. Oh, it's up at the top. There we go. Stop share. There we go.
There we are. And then I'll get rid of that. Okay, and then we'll just have a little bit of Q&A back and forth between you and I.
Sure.
Yeah. So when I disappeared off screen, I madly took notes on the things that you were saying. It's just, you gave us lots to work with. I'm so pleased. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Let's find the things I starred. Okay. We'll start at the beginning. Seriously, I have like 6 pages, but it was like, just good light. Okay. All right.
Well, hopefully they'll enjoy it as well. So great.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll start page 1. Okay. So you're quoting Dennis Williams talking about John Muir. And you referenced the Book of Nature, which, by the way, is even older than the medieval period. You find it in Basil of Caesarea, like you find
Really?
it in
That's
the early centuries. And of course, like you find it's obviously, scriptural. It's in like Psalm 19, the heavens declare, and without words, I'll quote it wrong. But anyways, silent words of creation.
Yeah, the oldest that I could find is Robert Grosseteste, who uses the word "the nature is a book." But that's so much about you found it in Basel. Wow.
I think so.
Interesting.
It is in the patristic kind of world of vocabulary. Yes, it is. if not kind of that precise phrase. That notion is, really important from the beginning. Okay, so right, so you're quoting Dennis Williams, and talking about God's wilderness, and then I kind of copied down this line about kind of unmarred by civilization, and you got all the way back to that at the end. So you've already kind of answered that, but I wonder if is there, and you even use the words like nature versus culture, this kind of this hope for peace, but like a little bit of an awkward fitting together between this kind of pristine wilderness and then what are we to do with civilization or human culture, and this this sort of vision of maybe nature bereft of humanity is somehow sort of better at expressing its like logos, it's linked to the creator. So what are your thoughts on those things? And I'll just add one more thing that's sort of like phenomenologically, like I feel much more peaceful in like on a mountain or on a beach than I do on a busy street. So there's something there just in your basic kind of experience. I don't know many people who feel very peaceful in like the middle of London or something. They may be happy culturally that they're there, but like sensory wise, not usually.
Yeah, there is obviously quite a big psychological basis, for going out. It's one of the, I have psychologist friends who say that's one of the greatest antidotes for depression and all these sorts of mental anxiety, these things, is getting away. I do though don't want to tie too much of the Christian framework to romanticism, because I think that is the danger of romanticism. Still kept this, I think what you very nicely said, this nature culture divide. Culture bad, nature good. Whereas in prior history, you nearly get this culture good, nature bad. And it nearly was a reaction against it without actually challenging the framework that it rested upon. And what I love about the Christian framework is you brought up the idea of a logos, with this singular intelligible principle by which God created the world. Well, the logos became flesh. And it was this enfleshment, this incarnation that we can use as Christians and to say, yeah, God values the world. That's the fundamental event that we can reference and say that is the justification for the valuing of the material creation, is the incarnation of the logos. But the logos was also a man. The logos was also a human being. And that's why I think the microcosm idea, it really speaks to me that in the human person that Christ became, he subsumes all of creation. That's what I love about the Eastern frameworks. You talked about Basil of Caesarea. I actually pull from the Cappadocians quite a bit on this idea, is that the human soul, in a sense, subsumes the lower orders of the rational soul, the rational capacities. And that's why I think in becoming human, Christ subsumes all of creation. I love that idea. And I think that gives value to creation without denigrating humanity. And I think that gives us a framework for understanding that culture isn't opposed to nature in a dualistic fashion. In a sense, culture can become the fulfillment of nature if we so let it, through a Christocentric perspective, that we can see the city and the garden sitting together. And that's why I want to sort of challenge this framework that I think a lot of our conversation goes on. I know ecocentrism tries to challenge that, but I'm not sure it can overcome it in a very sort of healthy way. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great. And I love that you kind of put emphasis on the word, like the word became flesh and like became man, because we can sort of go a little ways and be like, well, he became matter, and like we mean man, but like to not kind of delve and kind of dwell there for a moment about what that does for culture. Just kind of reflecting on my inclinations when I feel at my grumpiest. I'm like, I hate all humans, including myself.
There was, and I nearly slipped into this. I lived in Vancouver for 3 years. Vancouver is one of the most environmentally conscious cities on the planet. I think they rank themselves second. You can go fact check me on that. That's what I was consistently told, though, is the second in most environmentally city on the planet. But there was an aspect to the cultural milieu that I caught, which was human interaction bad, nature creation on its own good. I try to use the word creation, but creation on its own good.
Yeah.
And to me, that still kept the dualism. And
Yes.
to me, that was the bad, because it nearly sort of, yeah, it keeps us from this fatalistic anti-human attitude, um,
Yeah.
which is going to be the great risk.
I think I went next to ask you. Okay, I'll go with where so when you're kind of talking about this kind of role of humanity, in this sort of, you talked about like fulfilling of nature. We've already used the word kind of the logos or the logoi of creatures and of all of creation as a whole, and humanity kind of because of the incarnation, and you also referenced Genesis, so because of our kind of place in the created order. So, okay, holding that kind of logos, Genesis, incarnation, and then also you went a little bit into this idea about like hierarchies, which to modern ears are like, oh no, the
Yeah.
evil baddie. We don't know why, but hierarchy is always categorically wrong. But you kind of tried to use the word hierarchy in a kind of a positive sense about these kind of descending and ascending hierarchies of being. And I wonder if the kind of place where you're trying to kind of articulate the place of humanity and of Christian thought in care for the environment, in harmony with the environment, and in the kind of movement of redemption, that kind of place of discerning those hierarchies and doing something about discerning those hierarchies and discerning that teleology could be described as kind of a priestly role, like, and not just a clerically priestly role, but like as in the like the priesthood of believers, that there being something kind of ironic about yeah, about that place kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're 100% right. To even talk about hierarchies is controversial. But I think a lot of environmentalists are realizing, because of these pushbacks to ecocentrism, the intrinsic value perspective, that we need a way of measuring hierarchies, because you end up with these colonialist attitudes where you're telling indigenous peoples they can't hunt any of the creatures that they traditionally have hunted because their life is not as valuable as the prey that they're hunting. I mean, just as a moral intuition, I think we all recognize that the cockroach that's scurrying around underneath my floorboard right now is not as valuable as the two people talking right now. There's a certain values that we're making all the time, that these value judgments that we're making all the time. And if we don't do that, we risk creating a greater ethical problem, as great an ethical problem as the one we're trying to solve. So the recognition of hierarchies is to protect us as much as it is anything else. Protect the environment as much as it is to protect us. We think of these hierarchies as protecting us, as putting us on the top, but it's also about protecting the world, and to recognize that yes, we need to make these value judgments all the time, that certain creatures deserve more protection than others. This is the sort of ethical juggling that they're forced to do as environmentally conscious people all the time. The question is, are we going to do it well? And I think the idea that you brought up, the priests of creation, right? That gives us this idea of, okay, we do have an ontologically distinct way, but it is the same. The Christian understanding of that is not the absolute monarch or this dominion narrative that you find in Francis Bacon. It's priestly. It's an act of service. That's why I wanted to use the word Christocentric, is because the idea, if Christ is our model of what it means to lead, that leadership looks a whole lot like service. That looks a whole lot like sacrifice. That looks a whole lot like, though he was above us, he put himself below us. And I think that gives us the model by which to see this chain in a healthy way. It's a way that's not domineering, that's not subverting nature to only our values. It's a way of recognizing our dependence upon the world and then serving the world according to its needs. And thus, in conjunction with that, serving our own needs through that. And I think all of this sort of fits together in a beautiful picture that we get from the Christian framework, which, call it patristic, call it medieval. Honestly, I don't think there's a dualism there. Obviously, there's a continuity there. So, yeah.
Yeah, certainly. That's reminding me when you were talking about the perfection of the world. And so like all these kind of little teleologies, all these kind of inner goods
Hmm.
building into greater and more kind of communal goods to like a cosmic good shared kind of by all things, by all created things. And then, and of course, so that's kind of like return to God, but then you can be really kind of distinctly Christological and say like to Christ, for whom, through whom, and towards whom all things were created. And what you were describing about these kind of the flourishing of those goods working together made me think a bit about virtue theory.
Yeah,
And
it should.
that, okay, which is good because, right, we're doing ethics. But it made me think about temperance. So, originally, before I did any reading on, the origins of virtue thought, I'm like, okay, temperance is teetotaling, right? Like the temperance movement, that was the
Yeah,
level
yeah,
of understanding that I had. But I read this really lovely, you read like Aristotle on temperance, and there's this really lovely line in Plato. I'm sorry, I don't remember what work, but he's talking about, so all the virtues are kind of like chords or they're strands of music, and then temperance naming like they're functioning together in a kind of
yeah.
coherent harmony. It's sort of like the integrity of the whole being what temperance actually means. And that, so when you were talking about kind of a cumulative and culminative perfection that we can
Hmm.
kind of have as a like an object to think, to kind of work towards when we think ethically about creation, it made me think of that, and this kind of the chords kind of harmonizing together into a bigger kind of piece of music.
Yeah. And so to expand upon that, this actually was a section that I did cut, is I wanted to talk a bit about how Thomas Aquinas worked that out. And I thought he had a very beautiful image, kind of like what Aristotle did. He talks about different levels of goods. He talks about individual level goods. He gives 4 levels. It's a reduced framework in his work, Summa Contra Gentiles. The lowest level is my own good. And he gives the example of food. Food is good for me. But then there's a higher level good, which is good for, say, my family or my species. It's a good with respect to my form, like universally, and that would be like reproduction. That would be a sort of classic example. Having a child quite often is a drain on the parents, could be quite taxing upon them, but they're
What?
nevertheless, yeah, believe it or not, I'm talking to a parent right
I
now.
know Seth and I are like going against the minutes when 4 of my progeny are going to burst through the doors and yell something and say a bad word, and it'll be in our video, put it on YouTube.
Perfect illustration. Perfect illustration of my point. But you sacrifice that, your own personal goods, for the sake of some higher good. And that's the good of, say, the species. But then Thomas doesn't end there. He says there's actually a universal good. And I love the example he uses, which is the sun giving light to plants. The sun doesn't benefit, and yet we can still call that a good because it benefits. This universal system that Thomas gives, and that's the third level. And finally he gives the final, which is the similitude of the world to God.
Mm.
That is the highest good. How much can we reflect God's perfections and creations back to God? What's interesting to to Thomas, is because God is infinite goodness, the more ways we can do that, the better we reflect God. And I think that's an image we should have, is that why are we preserving all the biodiversity? It's because only together can we reflect back to God the perfection that God is in any way analogous like we ought to, the best way that we can. It's only together that we hit this highest level of perfection. And Thomas says the higher perfections, the more a being itself is more perfect, the higher perfection that it strives for. So the question is do we want that perfection for ourselves? Because again, Thomas is saying our own perfection, our own goodness can only be met as a community, as a world created community. I
Mm.
love that image. And this is just in a few paragraphs in Summa Contra Gentiles, but that was one of those points where you just got to set the book down and reflect on it for a few
Mhm.
minutes.
Mhm. No, and that's glorious. It's like I'm so glad, like, I set up you to do that, because you just gave, in what you just kind of articulated, you gave this kind of perfect example of some of your final points, where kind of the world needs not simply more scientists, although scientists are amazing. I mean, I, as like a type 1 diabetic, am alive because of scientists
Yeah.
fiddling around and being like, oh, why don't I give my dog some shots of insulin and find what happens? So hooray science. But as you said, we could drown in facts and kind of not be moved to do anything, but you're very kind of specific articulation of like, well, what is that intrinsic good of creation, which, as you said, what was it, the ecocentrist wouldn't be able to say. They'd want to say so kind of robustly this inherent good, but like, what is the shape of that inherent good? But when you kind of leaned on Aquinas and were like, well, the similitude to the divine, and you're like, that's what we were made for, that's what we're made of.
Mhm.
And so to lean so heavily into that is amazing. So comment 1, just simply, I love it. Comment 2 is that because we're going to, present our discussion here to people training for the priesthood, and for a liturgical priesthood, that do you think that there is something about then, not just the way Christians talk, but the way we worship, that is poised and able to be kind of sensitive to the kind of the symbolic, the sacramental, the calling of created things to be similitudes, to be reflections of the divine, and that's part of our kind of unique capacity and unique calling and duty and obligation in this regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Giving we live in a world that's quite hostile to the idea of a symbolic worldview, and quite often we have a very univocal, flat ontological understanding of the world. I think recapturing that within the church community is going to be the best hope that we can as a church for impacting the environmentalist movement and therefore impacting the world through that. I think this is our offering to the world. I had to go over it real quickly. The biggest changer, the biggest thing that marks change in action is not facts or knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up, as Paul, very prophetically said. It's demographics. It's when you get around a community that cares, that love is caught. It's not taught. That love for nature is caught. What I think is real interesting, this is something that I think about, is there's more money devoted to caring for homeless dogs and cats than there is any other species on the world. Dogs and cats are not in danger of going extinct. I love dogs and cats. I'm one of the biggest lovers of dogs and cats in the world. I love them. But I got to ask the question, why do we care so much? And it's because we live in community with them. It's because we see people playing with their dog. It's because you see Arms of the Angel being played and little sad images going. It's caught. We don't need to know how much money is going in. You could tell me that, and how much the need is, but that's not going to affect me as much as one sad picture of a dog, or going out and playing with my dog and thinking about the dog because they don't have owners to play with. So if we want people to care about that bug that no one's ever seen, we have to capture their imagination in the same way that these other mechanisms have. If we want people to care about the world, facts aren't going to do it. We need to capture the imagination of people to see the world in the same way, and care for the same world, that care again in the same way that we have this care for the cat down the street or the dog inside our own home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that like relates to love too. Yeah.
Fundamentally, yeah.
Yeah.
We are creatures of love, yeah.
And I was about to kind of pit that against like, oh, well, we need to love the cat and the bug because they kind of statically they make a similitude of the divine. But really they wouldn't need to be kind of pitted against each other, because in the end, my love for Finny, our dog, was barking during your presentation. So I was really glad I had muted by then. So like, my love for him and his stupid, sweet little dog face participates in divine love and needs to, like, obviously my love can't end at Vinny's stupid, cute little dog face because that's idolatry. But it's like, but it's like a that's a stream that I can also ride into the love of God, who made all these things. He made his little face and those little doggy eyes and the weird and wonderful details about the obscure bug that you kept referencing.
Yeah, the obscure bug. That's always my sort of like test case. Can we justify the love for the bug that no one cares about off in the Amazon forest, you know? Yeah, and 100%, 100%, you know, our dog Indigo, I was there desperately hoping he didn't bark, which he loves doing right in the middle of all our conversations. But yeah, like that's, I think you've captured it right there, is like when we give that divine framework for seeing the meaningfulness, not only for ourselves, not only for the creature, but for ourselves as well. When we see ourselves as part of the community, which that's what I do like about Aldo Leopold's framework. I had to brush over it real quickly, but Aldo Leopold's framework about seeing ourselves as part of a world community is great. The only problem is that I think that Leopold's view ultimately only can make sense of all of our ethical intuitions, of all these competing interests, whenever it's grounded in a Christocentric framework. And when we see this community aspect, but we see it as conduits, kind of like you said, this stream flowing back to God and our love for God. That's where I think we can look at the environment again, as kind of Muir did, and see it in this as a sort of sacred expression of God, of himself to us.
Yeah, so then love kind of begins to fuse into worship, and they kind of entangle and they start becoming kind of one thing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah.
So I think we've been going for about an hour, so we'll draw it to a close. But can I just express again, just immense thanks. Your presentation was so interesting, really informative, really kind of provocative, and also kind of contemplative and adorative as well. So
thank you so
I'm
much.
so thankful. Thank you very much for sharing with us. That's it. That's all. Thanks so much, Seth.
Thank you.